Anita, how's your mental health?
Questionable at all times. You know this.
Yeah, how's the mental health of your children?
Also a little bit tricky. Can I tell you my experience in trying to find therapists for myself and my kids, Mel?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is how it goes. You ask around your friends and your family for a referral for somebody who's nearby. You finally find somebody who sounds like they might work for your family. You give them a call and you find out that A, they're not accepting new patients, or B, they have a huge wait list. So you start over again and you ask people if they know anybody who would be a good therapist and a good fit. Finally, you find one, you go and you meet with them, and you figure out that you don't actually like them that much. But it's been so much work to find somebody who you can go to in your area that you're kind of stuck with them. Well, do you have any ideas for how to get around this?
I do because guess what? I've actually had some therapists that I have found on my own, which involves what you're saying. Sometimes I remember one time I was like 3 hours in the bathtub on my phone looking
Yeah.
through websites. I was such a prune at the end. But I have also had the experience with working with BetterHelp. And it was like, I don't want to say too good to be true, but because it is true, but it's like amazing because I was matched with my therapist within 24 hours.
And you didn't have to go through all of that other ridiculous process of trying to find somebody. And here's the cool thing too, is if that person didn't work out for you, you can just switch and say, and it's not like you're committing to another years long search for somebody who you're going to jive with.
It's true. And I lucked out, or maybe just BetterHelp is really good at matching people together because I never had to change my therapist. I loved her. Perfect fit for me. And I know that some of our friends have used BetterHelp and they've had to change therapists, and boom, same day, you can change.
Easy peasy.
You can ghost your therapist. Get a new one.
I love this idea. BetterHelp is one of our sponsors. If you use our promo code trybetterhelp.com/WWDN, you get 10% off your first month. And we totally recommend it.
Yes, get some therapy. That's trybetterhelp.com/WWDN. Anito the mosquito.
Mel the Bell.
Wow, that was real good. Anyway,
We're poets.
but at least it's not Sunday when we're recording this, so you're
Mhm.
in an okay mood. Maybe, fingers crossed.
Yeah, it's Saturday today and it's rainy and cold. We came back from San Diego where it was beautiful and sunny and there were no children. Back to rainy, cold, and fighting with each other children. So, welcome home.
Yeah. How has your reentry been?
Well, I think we need to talk about what happened when we tried to re-enter because that was an interesting experience. We recorded our update from Camp Widow and then we came home the next day and the airport was an interesting experience.
You guys. So, like, here's me. Yeah, we made it through Camp Widow and we're doing awesome. And then now we're going to go home. And like, we made it to the airport on time and everything is going according to plan and cool. End of story. And we walk in. Do you want to tell it? Do you want me to tell it?
Well, I mean, we'll both tell it because here we both are. They had some, I don't know how to explain it, but there were people kind of directing traffic a little bit and they had some caution tape up to make you not go in one door, but come in another door. And I mean, there's construction everywhere. So just assume that. And I walk in and, and I walk towards where I think I need to go. And there is a man, and this is a warning to people. If you don't want to listen to this, then don't. But
death warning. So fast forward if you need to.
Yeah, there was I think it was a man. I'm not even 100% sure. And they were actively giving him CPR on the ground.
It was a lady.
Was it?
Yeah.
I did not look closely or carefully enough.
All I saw was you fell to the ground and I thought, oh, you need breakfast. I was like, and I was like, what in the world is happening? Like, oh, Anita just must be dizzy. Like she's low blood sugar or something. And then I looked past and I saw, and then it made sense.
Yeah, it was a really weird, surreal, I don't even know. And my brain was telling me, like, don't freak out. Like, this is fine. But then I was like, no, I'm going to freak out right now. And so, but we still had to be in that area. It's not like we could avoid being there because that's where you had to check in your baggage. And it was just so weird how everything was just going on like normal ish. And then there's this person who's maybe dying on the ground. And I had about 7 million thoughts, like in the time that we were in that area, and my brain wasn't working, but just was thinking, like, why is it taking so long for the EMTs to get here? And why is everybody just wandering around like everything's normal? And, is that person going to die? And are they alone? Is their family here? Like, what is somebody going to get terrible news? Why haven't they taken this person to the hospital? Just all of these things. And feeling just kind of flooded with, I don't even know what the right word is, flooded with trauma feelings and just upset. So we had to go and give our bags, and I just started crying at the man. And I'm sure he was like, why?
Okay.
Weird?
I'm going to tell this part because I was watching it all.
Okay. So maybe my memories are weird.
Yeah. Anita shuts down. And so then we still had to drop our bags off right there. So we go over there and you had a meltdown. And thank goodness that ticket agent person was like one of the nicest, kindest people on the planet. He handled you really well, I think. And he was like so kind. And I don't even know if you remember what you said. Do you remember what you said?
I said, I'm sorry, I'm crying. I said that.
And you started telling the story of how Jason died.
Oh, no, I don't remember saying that.
Yeah. So you were like, and I don't know why I didn't even see him die, but like, I keep thinking that, yeah, you told him the story and he's like, I'm so sorry. And he like, you could tell he wanted to hug you, but he couldn't tell because of COVID. So he put his hand on your shoulder and then I went around you and I went, whoo, and like grabbed you and bear hugged you and just stood there. Do you remember any of this?
No.
Okay. Yeah. I was like, hey, what do I do? Cause the funny thing is like later when you posted about this on your Instagram and you mentioned your thoughts about what was happening, I was like, when I was watching it happen, I was like, well, my thoughts were the same too, but I didn't feel traumatized by it. I was like, oh, maybe that's what Scott looked like. And I wasn't there when Scott died either. So it's interesting because we both of our husbands had to be like attempted to be resuscitated. Neither of us were there to see it, but we had different reactions. I don't know, but thank goodness that like as a team, we made it through security, but it took you several hours to like kind of come out of that. Like Anita was basically like you could put your hand in front of her eyes and she was just like, we didn't even talk about it. We didn't talk about it the whole rest of the time, but we made it.
When I did get home though, I did think about you. I was like, I wonder if Mel has those feelings about that also, or if they're different. They must be different because you didn't have that same reaction.
It's weird though, because, well, I didn't have the feelings of someone needs to get here and they're doing it wrong. Like, why isn't this happening? I was looking at it and I was like, that's probably what Scott looked like. And then I think I have this weird thing in my brain where it just like shuts off and I go into observation mode that's non-emotional. And I was like that when I had to see his body for the first time. I was so worried about it, like in the what's it called, mortuary. And we went into the room and I was expecting to be all like go insane. And instead I just went into like, oh, why is that there? Why does this look like this? Oh, tell me what happens to the body when this, I'm sure it's my brain protecting me, but
kind of removed.
But it was the same thing. Yeah, it was removed, but I was watching. And then I was also like more worried about you than me. But I think like when you and I are together, as I am always trying to like understand other people's situations, like a lot of times I'm more sensitive to maybe your situation than mine. And I think that was happening because I was like, I hope Anita's not stressed out that she has to carry this box of books on top of her suitcase. Like I was just like, okay, let's get Anita out of here. But I was like, oh, this is weird. I'm not having a response like Anita because that happened to Scott. And I thought through the whole thing, but I don't know, maybe it just worked out so we could get through the airport and only one of us was not coherent for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, just the thought of somebody collapsing and then somebody, finding them and then having to take care of them just really, I've had that kind of thing happen not too often, but to be honest, that's the first time, which is weird because I am a medical person. I've seen somebody getting CPR in person. I've seen a lot of videos and I've seen a lot of like training, things like that, but that was the first time. And it was just a really weird, just how it looked was upsetting and weird. And then guess what, Mel?
What?
So on Wednesday, was it Wednesday or Thursday? My daughter called me from school and said, Mom, somebody just collapsed in the office and they're getting her CPR. And I was like, what in the world is happening? And she was having a panic attack outside of the counselor's office. And I ended up having to go get her from school. So a mom had collapsed in the office. And I'm like, oh, something's in the air right now for weird. And I felt this weird, like, is she traumatized because I told her about my story? Or is that her own native feelings?
I mean, if I were a kid watching that, I definitely would. That happened when I was younger and I was a kid and it happened outside of our house.
Really?
And it like affected me for a long time. Yeah. I remember running in the closet and it was our neighbor that had a seizure disorder, but it was so jarring. Like, but man, does it just feel like, I don't know if our quote innocence has been taken away since being a widow, but it seems like there's so much. And I wonder how many people, due to stress of COVID stuff and just life in general, like are more susceptible to having heart issues. So take care of yourselves, y'all.
Yeah, I don't know. And I was just like, who is with that person? Because there was nobody that looked like they were.
Are you talking about the airport?
At the airport.
Oh, there was a person. Yeah.
There was?
Yeah.
Okay.
You were just tunnel vision.
Maybe.
And I was like, I got to get Anita out of here. And like, okay, there's.
Well, now I feel bad for that person too. So
I did too, but like.
Yeah, but there's nothing you can do about it either in that scenario.
Hopefully that person will not be in our Widow Wives Club because things turned out differently, but. Yeah,
that's what we're going to hold hope for. So that was the explosive ending of our Camp Widow experience, but Camp Widow was still awesome and amazing. And it was still worth it. So.
It's like, I mean, of course it has to end that way. Of course, widow camp has to end that way. It can't just be like, fine.
It can't be like whimper home, like, goodbye. Yeah.
Yeah. Like somebody's on the floor, maybe not surviving at the airport. And then we get rerouted a million different ways and we get home later. So all in all, it was successful. Anita's hopefully recovered from that, but now you're a mom again at home.
I know. And my house is torn apart. We're down 2 bathrooms, which is always good and fun times, which has increased the stress level, but it's going to be okay. At least it's not Sunday.
Oh man. Well, I have had a lot of migraines this week, every single day. Seasons are changing and I get Botox shots for my migraines. And it was when that round kind of ran out. So
are you due for more?
I went yesterday.
Oh,
so
good.
Yeah. So I don't know, but I played tennis today with my dad, like we do on Saturdays. And I learned that he loves every kind of pork product and he listed all of them.
Just out of the blue.
Unprompted. Yep.
Yeah. Are there any pork products he does not like? Did he say anything in that?
No, all of them.
Okay.
I told him he should just get a pig. Let's go buy a pig. Anyway.
That's a lot of work though.
That's life when you're a widow and you're with your parents.
My dad is into making protractors. I'm not even joking. I walked in from the airport. He's at my house. Not 5 minutes later, he shows me his measuring ice wheels.
Oh man,
so
I love it.
Parents are funny and they're funny. So yay, parents. Yay, parents.
Yay. Well, we hope that if you've not checked it out yet, you have checked on our website, widowwedonow.com, to check out where in-person meetups are. And if you don't see one in your location, please email us if you would like to facilitate. We need facilitators. The job's not too hard. Basically, you just hang out with people if you want. And that can include just like going to get lunch or hanging out at a park or like getting on a text thread, whatever. So please email us if you're interested. And if you do find your area, email the facilitator so that you guys can start hanging out.
It'll be amazing. And while you're on our website, you will see that we have t-shirts, and other merchandise. We have some amazing and funny grief shirts. If you want to check them out, our Be Nice, My Husband is Dead shirts are on there, as well as This Is How I Widow, I Have a Widow Problem. Lots of different fun t-shirts. Get on there, check it out. They will ship to anywhere in the world.
Theoretically. Australia.
We have had one, but she reordered them and they are like coming this time. So.
Oh, good. My personal favorite right now is Body by Grief. That's a funny one. So yeah, if you want snarky grief wear, check out our website. Also, we have some stuff on there that is appropriate for public consumption. So not everything is kind of shocking. So check it out.
Yes.
Resilience.
If you want to help us keep the podcast going, come join us on our Patreon. It's patreon.com/WWDN. It's just a way for people to support content creators, including podcasters like Mel and I.
This is helpful for us, so thank you. If you are a patron on the Patreon, we give a shout out to certain levels on our Patreon, so we're going to do that now. We're going to start with our first secret dead husband. And to her and to all of you, we say, the long and winding widow dun, dun, dun,
to your heart.
Hey, Paul McCartney's a widower, even though he's remarried. He was a widower when the day that I got my driver's license, Linda McCartney died. So
interesting.
Anyway, next we have Constance Dahlbeck,
David Kelly,
Don Satterwhite,
Gail Paxton,
Ivan the Misner, the astronaut,
Cat,
Krista Waite,
Sam Finlayson,
Amy
Sapp,
Ashley Hahn,
Christina Shiflett,
Danielle Catterberg,
Not a Debbie Downer,
Fitted Sheet Dennis Brazo,
Jenny Taylor,
Jennifer Brown. We hung out a lot.
She's taller than I anticipated.
And very cool.
Jennifer Hassel,
Jenny Wang. Also, we hung out with her.
We met her. Kathy Murray,
Kirsten Spooky Scary Stromberg,
Leslie Webb,
our Auntie Marie Hoffman.
She has the most beautiful skin.
Yeah, Marie, Anita couldn't stop talking about your skin. What are you doing?
That sounds kind of spooky or like creepy when you said it like that.
Well, you are creepy. Anyway, Missy Schubert.
Rachel Barbosa, who wins a major award. You guys, she drove like 7.5 hours to pick things up for me.
She's the best. Sarah Morris.
Sylvia Shore. I'm not sure of her pork product status.
Sometimes we assume that unless we had a huge life insurance payout, we don't really need to know anything about investments or even finances. But guess what? A little knowledge of finances is critical for all of us. Maybe your partner was in charge of that stuff, and now you find yourself making all the decisions. Maybe you're mad about that. Maybe I am. Nicole from the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast is here to help. She tackles financial literacy by telling the stories of women and widows and finance experts, and shares the lessons they've learned as certified financial planners. Whether you know a lot and feel confident in your financial decisions or feel unsure about all of that stuff, there is more to learn. Listen and subscribe to the He's Gone But the Money's Not podcast on all podcast platforms. This ad was paid for by Rockhouse Financial, an SEC-registered investment advisor.
I think she likes pork products. Maybe not all of them like my dad, but I don't know. They're kind of similar.
Okay.
Karen Cornejo.
Vicky Spit, the widow of Kirchhoff.
Anna Tracy.
Christina Scambato.
Christine Anderson.
Looks like she's having a nice weekend.
Oh, good.
Cindy Raynaud.
Mindy Holmgren.
Don Barber.
Debbie Fells.
Diana Becker.
Emily Thornton.
Emily Toledo, who also wins an award for taco consumption with us.
Thank you. Aaron Posick.
Gabe Lozano.
Ian Cini.
Ileana Bell Ruiz.
Chauffeur Jackie Coyle.
Jane.
Your mom.
Yeah.
Jenny Barrow.
Jocelyn Milo.
Oh, she gives us tacos too. Thank you. Fancy Lady.
Julie Stevenson.
Karina Jacobo.
Katie Radcliffe.
Kara Scara.
Lori Farrington.
Marjorie Lewis.
Mary McGowan.
Peter Rukavina.
Sarah Kennedy.
Shannon Helm. Okay, we don't know how to say your last name, Stacy, so tell us. Is it Saywert or Sewert? Like
Sewert. Okay, let us know.
Sunshine Haven.
Tammy Schwartz.
Tara Wallace.
Val Packer.
And Octopus Taco Wendy.
You guys, octopus tacos just taste like hot dogs. It's fine. Don't ask questions.
Thanks to everyone who has joined our Patreon so far. If you would like to join and you're not a member, please consider joining us at patreon.com/WWDN. And if you want to give Anita an octopus taco, which sounds really kind of like it has a double entendre.
It doesn't.
Check us out at
buymeacoffee.com/widowwedonoww.
Remember to check out the Widow Wives Club on Facebook. It's free, it's a support group, and it's private. It's on Facebook. We would love to see you in there.
Just make sure you answer all of the questions. We really won't let you in if you don't answer the questions. And thank you to the people who help us letting people in.
And fun fact, if you're a scammer and you want to join the Widow Wives Club, maybe wait longer than 12 minutes from starting your Facebook account to then try and join our club. We're not dumb.
We're not. We weren't born yesterday. Should we get to our episode, Mel?
Yeah.
Let's do it. I'm Anita.
I'm Mel.
We're two young widows. We're just trying to figure out
Widow.
We
You.
do
Now. Do.
now.
Hey listeners, just a heads up that there are a few times in this episode where there may be some content that is sensitive for some listeners. We talk about the effects of trauma and describe a few situations in a detailed manner. So we just want to let you know in case you need to fast forward 30 seconds when these topics come up. Also, special thanks to the Misner Family Foundation for sponsoring this episode.
Ooh.
What if we started a hand clamping band?
A hand clamping?
A hand clapping band. That's a tongue twister for me.
You know that it's my dream to clap on a music track someday, like a professional music. Like be the one in the...
I can facilitate that.
I ask you all the time, Mel, should we introduce our guest or should we just talk about nonsense some more?
Well, I mean, he might want to talk about clapping with us since he's now part of our band.
Well, I was thinking that listening to that concert, then I'd say, I can hear Anita clapping. That's Anita clapping for sure.
I have a very distinctive clap. I've been told that before.
Perhaps Anita could win a Grammy for best clap on an album.
Wow.
Can that please be a category, please? Oh my goodness. Mel.
What?
Today we have a very fancy pants with us.
Like for real, though.
Like a for real fancy pants. And his name is Dr. Dawson Church.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining us.
You know, I hate to tell you this, but my fancy pants are my pajamas. I never bothered changing out of them today. So I'm looking down here and thinking, not that fancy actually. But I'm all here and I'm looking forward to hanging out with you for the next while. Thank you for having me.
The beauty of Zoom, right?
I know.
You don't even have to wear any pants.
No, you have to tie from the waist up and look pretty respectable. But, you know, in fact, when I teach live classes, we if it's a 5-day class, we have a crazy pants day during the class when everyone stands up and shows everyone else what they're wearing from the waist down.
Is this just post-pandemic?
Post-pandemic, and these are classes on professional etiquette. The questions, the classes on how to present yourself as a professional effectively, and it's dead serious the whole way through. And then we have the crazy pants day at the very end. So,
I want to be in that class. That sounds fun. Well, I can tell that we're going to have a really fun time talking today because we're talking about something that's serious and helpful, but you're so cool and fun. So we are really excited that you're joining us today. Thank you.
Happy to join you. And you know, this is interesting. I was thinking about this earlier, that there are such difficult things in all of our lives, and yet the kind of energy we bring to it and the kind of perspective we have on it makes all the difference. And that's what resilience is all about. That's what perspective is all about. That's what framing the way you see your world and your life is all about. And so none of us can escape the kinds of issues that we all have to deal with in life, and yet who you are as that person facing them and the tools you have makes all the difference. So I'm so thrilled to be going into those sometimes dark places together.
What are you a doctor of?
I have a degree in integrative healthcare and also one in natural medicine. And so I've been really focused for the last 30 years or so on the integration of conventional medicine with alternative medicine and how you get the best of all worlds. So you might go see an acupuncturist, or you might go see a person doing alternative medicine, an energy worker, and go see your doctor and your nurse and your psychotherapist as well. So bringing all of those together in integrative healthcare rather than seeing them as either one or the other.
Anita is a physical therapist. Can you integrate her as well?
Absolutely.
Dr. Dawson Church. So we found out about you and your work because we were talking about EFT on our podcast. I have been trying to do it to lower my anxiety. We also have friends, of course, that are widows or grievers that have been looking for ways to reduce anxiety. And, you know, we're all kind of in this grief soup together trying to figure out things that work for a lot of us. And one of our good friends of the podcast, Dr. Ivan Misner, introduced us to you. And it turns out you are an expert in this field. So will you tell us a little bit about EFT?
EFT is a really simple and effective tool for reducing emotional triggering. And what it is, what you actually do in EFT, it's often called tapping, because you are tapping with your fingertips on acupuncture points. So there are acupuncture points all over the body. There are 360 of them. They flow in meridians, and there are 14 meridians. And EFT has people tap while they process any kind of emotion that's bothering them. And so you process like you would normally process with a therapist or a coach or a friend. You're talking about the stuff that bothers you, and you're also tapping at the same time. And the cool thing is that when we put people into scanners, like an EEG scanner or an MRI, and we have them talk about the traumas of their lives, what we see is that the emotional brain, it's called the limbic system in the center of the brain, the emotional brain gets highly aroused. This lit up tissue, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, thalamus, amygdala, these parts of the brain get really active when we're processing and living an emotion, whether it's grief or anger or shame or blame, any kind of emotion. That emotional midbrain gets highly lit up. The cool thing is that when you give the body the stimulation of tapping, and there are other techniques as well, like breathing and time in nature. Other things will do it as well. EFT does it really fast, though. It just dials down the emotion, and you see people hooked up to an EEG or an MRI. You see that midbrain just quieten down, because the body is now getting this signal of calm and relaxation and balancing the energy system with the tapping. So EFT is tapping, it calms the emotional midbrain. It also is really good at bringing down stress neurochemicals like cortisol and adrenaline. They literally plummet as you tap. So do we all get stressed? We all do get stressed, and stress is part of everyday life. But can you effectively lower it quickly? You can, and you absolutely need that stress reduction skill so you aren't walking around stressed when you don't need to be.
I have a question. Who first thought that this was a thing to do? I can't imagine somebody being like, you know what, let's try tapping the top of our head and see if that lowers our cortisol level. Give it a try. And then they were like, hey, I feel better. Like, where did it come from? Who figured this out?
Watch two friends having an emotional conversation over lunch, and you'll hear the one say, I heard about that concert from, let's think, who was it now? And then I went there, and then there's this guy who was so rude. You won't believe what he said to me. And and then she tells her friend what the guy said. Her friend says, oh my God, I can't believe he said that to you. It's so horrible he said that to you. And then, so what I've done now in the last few seconds is I've modeled tapping on several parts of my face. We just tap all the time. We just tap all the time, and we naturally try and reduce our stress with physical things like breathing and tapping. EFT just organizes tapping into a set of a little ritual you do. It takes about a minute to do the ritual, and you just tap on these various points. Even things like I was in Paris. I go to Europe and teach every year. And I went into a Catholic church at lunchtime. And I was just there. I was just watching this beautiful shrine. And I suddenly realized as people walked in the door, they'd walk in the door, they'd kneel, they'd go like this, tap here, tap here, tap here, tap here, go get the host, do tapping like this, and walk out feeling great. So we just watch kids in a playground. They're tapping all the time. So tapping is a very natural way of reducing stress. But if you do all of your acupuncture meridian endpoints at the same time, which EFT organizes you to do, then you very reliably can reduce your stress.
So for those that are not watching on video, Dr. Church was tapping various points on his body. Wasn't the last one like the sign of the cross that you were doing?
Yeah, I was doing the sign of the cross.
Yeah.
I mean, this is called in acupuncture. This is the governing meridian. This is the central meridian. This is the kidney meridian. This is the stomach kidney meridian on the other side over here. So all of these are points that people naturally touch or tap.
So how did you get interested in this? What would you call it? Discipline?
Yeah, so just the field of energy psychology, energy healing. And when I was a kid, I had a kind of rough time growing up. And I wound up being suicidal as a teenager. I just wanted to kill myself. I couldn't stand the thought of being here another minute, another year. And I was depressed. I was angry. I was anxious. And I was in such bad shape. I remember I was 15 years old. I walked past a full-length mirror one day in a hotel and looked at myself. And I just thought, as I looked at my own face, I said to myself in my head, those are the saddest eyes I've ever seen. I was just such a miserable human being. So I went and lived on an ashram for a long time. I learned psychology. I learned all these ways to try and get a little bit happier. And I did get a bit happier over the years, but I still wound up pretty miserable at 25, 35, 45. And then I began to meditate every day. And that shifted things for me. And I learned to tap. And I suddenly found myself becoming not just happy, but really happy. And the anxiety and depression and the load of trauma that had weighed me down for all those years just went away. And so I just found myself getting into this much better state. And then I got interested in it for veterans. At that point, 2002, 2004, we had a lot of veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with PTSD. My therapist friends were saying, I have this veteran in my office and I tapped with her and her PTSD symptoms, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts went away. So I began to research that. We began to gather funds, gather research teams, do clinical trials, and it was mind-boggling. The very first one we did, we saw that people who did 6 one-hour sessions of EFT had a 60% reduction in PTSD symptoms. And so I used it myself. I did research into it. Now there are over 100 clinical trials. They all show very similar results. And so you do it yourself. You literally feel the burden of trauma dissipating from your body, and you feel much, much happier.
When you were talking about the brain scans, the EEGs, and the MRIs, have they done studies? It sounded like you were describing that they've done studies where they view the brain, and then while people are tapping, you can see that midbrain or the emotional centers of the brain calm down. Yes. Is that what you found in your studies?
Immediately, and it's really amazing to watch. Like I've in one of my books called Bliss Brain, I have images of people who are having an EEG hooked up and then tap, and you literally see all the brain waves of stress there. They're feeling anxious, they're feeling emotionally triggered. They tap, and those brain waves just disappear. It's astonishing.
That's amazing. See, Anita?
Is it magic? I mean, like, why?
Or is it like, I'm going to tap here and my kidney is stressed out, and if I can get my kidney to calm down, then I'm cool? Is that how it works?
Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001, A Space Odyssey, wrote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so, the compass looked like magic to people 500 years ago, and electricity looked like magic 200-300 years ago. So these things look like magic at the time. I mean, a brain scan to actually hook electrodes to your skull and know which neurons are firing. It's like, amazing. We can do this kind of thing. But yeah, it looks like magic. We now know, though, like for example, in one study I did, we had people either do EFT or talk therapy or rest in a clinic for 1 hour. So 1 hour they were sitting there quietly, or they were doing talk therapy, or they were getting EFT for only an hour. And in that 1 hour, for those who were doing EFT, their anxiety and depression dropped by twice as much as the talk therapy group. So it looks like magic. I mean, it's way, way, way quicker than conventional therapies. But then we measured their cortisol, and their cortisol plummeted. So adrenaline is going down, cortisol is going down, immunity markers are going up as those stress neurochemicals are coming down. So it looks like magic at first. You try it, it feels like magic at first, but there are really well-known pathways like genetic changes, like hormonal changes, like brain changes happening inside the body. It's not magic, although it certainly feels like it the first time you try.
So I just wonder if you want to add magician on the back of your name now. Like Dr. Dawson Church, all the letters / magician. Just take it into consideration. Just a suggestion.
I'm trying to learn to juggle right now. I wouldn't mind adding juggler to the end of my bio.
With chainsaws or just balls?
Just balls. I have an 11-month-old granddaughter, and when I'm taking care of her, when I'm babysitting her a couple of days a week, I'm trying to juggle to make her feel like, to amuse her. So so far, she's pretty amused at least by me juggling. But her standards are pretty low. So
now, when you mentioned that did you say about 60% of the PTSD symptoms were reduced?
Yep.
So we were looking up just before we got on Zoom with you some of your abstracts and journal articles, and so we found one: emotional freedom techniques to treat post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans. A review of the evidence, and it's a one of your studies that you did, and it says you surveyed 448 EFT practitioners. Is that correct?
Yes.
So everyone, this is a lot of people. This is not just like you go out and interview like 3 of your friends and then you have 60% reduction in like what they find. Like how long did the study take?
Well, some of our studies, like we did one. So I first saw people doing this for behavioral issues like anxiety and depression. Then I said, okay, if their anxiety and depression is going down, their cortisol must be going down as well. So I had that hypothesis. We then did this randomized controlled trial, triple-blind study, published in the oldest peer-reviewed psychiatry journal in North America, and it showed that cortisol dropped dramatically. Then I said, if cortisol is going down, that must mean that the genes that code for cortisol are being dialed down as well. Let's look at the genes. We then did several gene studies, and those took about 10 years. Those are very long, difficult, ambitious, expensive studies. We found literally that the genes that regulate emotion, regulate inflammation, regulate immunity, regulate cancer, all these genes were being affected by tapping. So that was really, really wild. Then I began to look at the brain imaging scans as well, same kinds of effects. So I've gone through this whole process, PTSD, originally looking at behavior, then at hormones, then at genes, then at brain scans, and what's going on inside your body. Like, Mel, you wouldn't believe it. If you think one negative thought, and I have you hooked up to an EEG, your stress brain waves just balloon outward. They become much, much bigger. A single negative thought can do that. Tap, think a positive thought, think a compassionate, loving thought for yourself or someone else, and then those stress brain waves will attenuate, will go away. So we are magicians, and we can have this effect on our bodies by our thoughts, our consciousness alone.
But how does it work? Do we know the mechanism that it works, or is it just we know it works, but we don't know how?
Well, we know behaviorally that it works. Usually in science, there's a long lag between us discovering that something works. We knew that willow bark worked. Native Americans knew that 1,000 years ago. And then we used willow bark preparations as a painkiller. We eventually extracted the active ingredient, aspirin. So we knew that aspirin worked. It took another 100 years before we knew how it worked. So with EFT, it's been about 20 years. We knew that it worked. Now we know that it changes gene expression, downregulates stress hormones, and really shifts neurological function. So we have a pretty good idea of the why as well as the how.
Wow. I think that's so interesting that you mentioned that it also helps with inflammation, because I think those of us that are going through intense stress, we're not thinking of that in those terms. We're just like, I need to get my anxiety down. I need to get my depression a little bit better. And, you know, like, who thinks of inflammation? Like, that's so fascinating.
Well, read the ACE study, and the ACE Adverse Childhood Experiences study showed that people with unresolved emotional trauma have much higher levels of cancer, heart disease, suicide attempts, smoking, diabetes, hepatitis, you name the issue. And people who have unresolved trauma have more of it. And the more unresolved trauma you have, the more of those things you get. So it is extremely important not to think of stress as a mental issue. I just want to feel better, I want to be less stressed. It's having a dramatic effect on your body. People who are stressed die decades earlier than people who are unstressed. So it catches up with you.
I love that you mentioned adverse childhood experiences. I mean, I don't love that that's a thing, but we have also talked about The Body Keeps the Score and Bessel van der Kolk's work, and I am personally obsessed with it, and it's so fascinating too, like the brain scans you talk about. Or I think with trauma, we think of PTSD, war veterans, but the book then goes on, of course, to talk about adverse childhood experiences or developmental trauma. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know that Dr. van der Kolk is right now trying to I don't know if it's get more traction for the word developmental trauma divided from PTSD, because it's kind of become a blanket word at this point for trauma. Like, people are like, well, I went to the store and I had a trigger because, like, I saw my ex and now I have PTSD. And it's like, well, there are differentiating circumstances for those things, but we have more trauma-informed research and, I guess, traction in the media now and kind of in life. What have you noticed as far as the rise of the popularity of talking about these things versus, say, like 10 years ago?
I think that people are willing to talk about them, think about them, disclose them, reflect on them much more than before, and they're beginning to realize their effects on their lives and their health. And so I think there's a rise in awareness of PTSD. For one thing, 2.5 million Americans cycled through Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a big number. A third of them are likely to be diagnosed with PTSD or have been diagnosed with PTSD. That's a very big number. That's like over 500,000 people, close to 1 million people are going to have PTSD. From the Vietnam generation, we had something like 500,000 Vietnam veterans with PTSD. And so with Vietnam veterans, we didn't have good ways of treating them. Now we have EFT, we have EMDR, we have various other tools like that, but it's part of the national conversation. And the terrible gift of the wars has been that we now have been forced to look at mental health issues and not stigmatize them anymore. Let people talk about their pain and start to find ways of processing it. The VA, the Veterans Administration, has been slow to adopt these techniques, EMDR, EFT, but they are adopting them to an increasing degree. EFT is now approved by the VA. EMDR has been approved for over a decade. Basically, EFT is take-home EMDR. EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, is a brilliant technique, but done in the context of therapy. EFT is self-help. It's like a version of EMDR you can do yourself. So as a society, we're now facing things like childhood trauma, and we're talking about that. When I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, if you were being molested or beaten by your parents or by people in your family, it wasn't talked about at all. It was regarded as a private matter. Now it's a public matter.
I love that you brought up EMDR and EFT, because I was going to ask if they were similar, and it sounds like that they are on the same continuum. Mel and I have both done EMDR, and it's been super helpful. And actually, I've done EFT with my daughter, who has crazy anxiety and was having panic attacks, and it did feel like magic, because I was like, I don't know why this is working, but it seems to be working, so I'll just keep doing it, and she was like, I don't know why we're doing this, but at the end, do you feel better? Yeah, I feel better. Is it a cumulative effect. So if you do EFT, is it just bringing down those cortisol levels in the short term, or does it have a long-term benefit? And did that question make sense?
Anita, that's a really brilliant question. I'm so glad you asked that because it's well worth asking that. So what the research tells us is that it brings down those cortisol levels, it brings down those symptom levels, and they stay down over time. Like I worked with a young Iraq veteran. He served 4 tours of duty in Iraq as a medic. And when you're a medic, you're dealing with dismembered bodies. You're dealing with people with severe wounds. You're dealing with people who are between life and death. And I did EFT tapping with him on one terrible memory he had from his time there. And during his first tour of duty, one of his friends was killed. And his friend had been shot through the head by a sniper. And he got the job of cleaning his friend's uniform to send his effects back to his next of kin back in the US. But his friend's body had been out in the Iraq sun before they could recover the body for 4 days, and it smelled really bad. And so this young man was literally, to clean the uniform in the medic hut, was having to run outside, take a bunch of deep breaths, and run back inside for a few seconds because the smell of the body fluids and blood on the uniform was so severe that you run back out again and hyperventilate, run back in, dip the uniform again. And as you can imagine, his level of emotional triggering was sky high. I asked him how bad it was on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being calm, 10 being the maximum. He was a 10 out of 10. And the tragedy of his friend's death, and then being confronted with cleaning the blood and body fluids off the uniform after 4 days, was unbelievably traumatic. But we were tapping like this while he talked, and his numbers went way, way, way down. Later on, I ran into him about 3 months later, and I tested him again. I asked again, what is your number now around the uniform? And it was still at 0. And this is shown in study after study after study. People lose those symptoms and they stay lost over time. So the research is really conclusive that people's numbers come down and they stay down. Not only did that happen, but this young man later said to me, he said, at the time, I saw it as one of the most horrific tragedies of my life. I now see it as a blessing. I'm glad I was the one chosen to clean his uniform and be able to send it back to his parents in the US. And so in psychology, that's called a cognitive shift. We have death, we have loss in our lives, and cognitive shifts can give those events meaning. We can't escape them. We all have bad things that happen to us, but what meaning do we give them? And the unspoken story, and I have a whole book called Bliss Brain about this. Bliss Brain is about post-traumatic growth, because a third of people get PTSD, but 2/3 see all those same sights and sounds and smells and experiences, and they not only do not get PTSD, many of them are able to really shift their lives in positive ways. And the untold story of trauma is that for 2/3 of people, research shows it results in post-traumatic growth, like that young man now seeing cleaning the uniform as an act of love rather than a tragedy. So that is the option that trauma and tragedy gives us, is the chance to actually not just recover from it, but to be resilient and grow and improve our lives in all kinds of ways as a result of it.
Our listeners, a lot of them are widows like us. I've been widowed almost 4 years. Anita, 3-ish. And we started doing this podcast kind of to put ourselves through the test, just to be like, we'll be the experiments. We don't know what we're doing. It's beta testing. Our lives have exploded. Let's see what happens. And we know that we're in, quote, the middle, trying to move forward and trying to make sense of these things that have happened to us. One question that Anita and I often ask ourselves on the podcast and ask experts, and there might not be an answer for this, but is there a time frame that comes and goes, and if you're not doing, like, functioning better, then you would consider yourself stuck in your trauma? Is there a time frame or a time limit?
Again, that is a really good question. And I remember a woman who came into one of my workshops a few years back. came into an EFT workshop, and she said, Dawson, I'm here because I just can't get over my husband's death. I I I'm just in this grief every day. I can't extricate myself from this grief. And so I talked to her over the course of the workshop, and one of the things I asked her about was how long it had been since her husband died. And she said, 15 years. And I knew when she said that her grief was not about her husband. It was about earlier unmourned losses in her life. It was about her grandmother dying when she was 3. It was about her pet bunny dying when she was 5. It was about her best friend moving away to Milwaukee when she was 7. And if we have this accumulation of unhealed emotional material from previous losses in our lives, then your husband dies when you're 30 and you're grieving for 15 years, not realizing that was just the trigger for all those earlier unhealed griefs. So what we do in workshops, when we have wonderful practitioners as well who work with clients on this, we help them go and work on not the most current trigger, but the originating loss that caused that problem of grief. And so I worked with this lady over the course of the workshop on not her husband 15 years ago, but the bunny and her grandma and her best friend as a child. And when all of those came down to a zero, when she completed her past, her grief about her husband's death 15 years earlier just disappeared. She had now gone back and she had resolved her past. So there's no fixed length of time, but often people are loading all of the unhealed material into their present trigger. And that's why it's so important, like those ACE survivors, go back and heal your past. At that point, the stuff in your present, you're dealing with it. If your husband dies, like happened to both of you, there's that grief is totally natural. But then if your partner or your husband or the person you're close to or your child, one of our practitioners had both her child died and her husband died. And again, she was so stuck in grief, she thought she would never, ever recover. Not only did she recover, she became one of our trainers, has trained and mentored hundreds of other people now. And again, you go back, you heal your past, then you still grieve when the bad stuff happens in the present, but you're only dealing with the present grief, not the overlay of old past unhealed grief. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I want to ask a question about generational trauma, and here's why. So my grandpa was a World War II vet in Patton's Army, liberated Dachau, I think, came back, married my grandma. They had 5 kids, and the youngest kid died suddenly at 18 months. So then there's this generation of kids that's still alive, which is my mom and my uncles. And I didn't realize it until recently when I'm going through my own trauma, but I'm like, oh, I look back and trace the trauma train. And of course, there were not resources for my grandpa, the World War II vet. My grandma was from like the Depression era, where it's like, well, who's going to talk about therapy and medication? It like wasn't really a thing. And also she never even took like aspirin, like no painkillers. So there's that. Then it's my parents' generation, the boomer generation. And so what they grew up with was those traumatized parents, and everyone's just doing their best, but they also still lived with parents that had unprocessed trauma, and then their own brother died. So they have unprocessed trauma. And now get to me, and I have my husband die, and I'm working through this stuff in therapy, and I have a sister too, and she's working through some other things as well, but we have come together and we're like, there is something with this generational trauma being passed down, and us, and we feel like we're the generation that's able to look back and be like, okay, how do we stop this cycle? Do you have anything to say about generational trauma? Are we making this stuff up in our heads? Are we just crazy? Like, what do you think?
Well, first of all, you're asking the right question. And the right question is, how do we stop this cycle? Can we stop the cycle? Because it's cyclical. And a huge amount of our way of coping comes from our parents and our grandparents. And so when you break that cycle, if you do break the cycle, you break it for your children and everyone coming along after them as well. It's powerful to do that. If you had asked people in science just a few years back, is intergenerational trauma a thing? They would have told you it's not. There's no mechanism to explain it. But now we have mouse studies going on 7 generations showing that a traumatized mouse will produce epigenetic changes in the mouse. Those epigenetic tags are passed along 7 generations. Epigenetics, by the way, is the topic of my first book, The Gene in Your Genes. It's all about epigenetics and about how the genome changes. Some of my studies have been about epigenetic tags on genes, and these can either express genes or suppress and silence genes, but that's another show, so I'll put it aside. But again, we've shown that trauma tags can be passed along 7 generations in rodent studies. In human studies, research shows that the epigenetic tags of Holocaust survivors from World War II are present in their granddaughters, not just their daughters, their granddaughters. We're passing along literally epigenetic information. Now, this is not changes in the genome itself. These are changes in the tags that make genes either turn on or turn off. So those are being passed along at least 3 generations. So if you can make the buck stop here, if you can say, I'm going to go to therapy, I'm going to tap, I'm going to do what it takes to heal myself, then you are literally producing epigenetic change in yourself and in your offspring. And then you don't pass along to the next generation. But if you don't do that, don't undergo the healing process, then you just pass it along. And Virginia Satir, do you know who she was? Maybe I'm dating myself here. She was the founder of the whole field of marriage and family therapy. She was probably the most famous therapist of the 1970s. And she literally is the cornerstone therapist who really put the whole field of marriage and family therapy in place. And so Virginia Satir said, here's how she defined a marriage. She said, a marriage is 2 sets of dysfunctional family patterns looking to come together to perpetuate themselves into the next generation. So don't do that.
They're just forming their own dysfunction. It's like we're taking 2 dysfunctions and we're making our own dysfunction for our children.
Earlier, you mentioned resiliency. Talk to us about that. How does one gain resiliency? Is it thought work? Is it patterns? Is it habits? Is it in genetics?
It is. It starts as thought and it becomes tissue. It begins as consciousness. It becomes neurological tissue. In Bliss Brain, I tell the story of a TV talk show host in Australia who wanted to learn meditation. So he took his whole TV crew into an advanced neuroimaging lab, got a whole workup, spent a whole day doing a workup on him, where they measured the volume of every single part of his brain, down to the last neural bundle. So detailed picture of his brain. He then began to learn mindfulness, meditation, and in 8 weeks, he found dramatic shifts happening in his personality. When he went back in the lab with his TV crew after 8 weeks, got all those brain scans a second time, they found that the emotion regulation circuit in his brain, it's called the dentate gyrus, beautiful little piece of tissue in the center of your brain, coordinates emotional regulation brain-wide. His dentate gyrus in just 8 weeks had grown by 23%. 23% more ability to control negative emotion like anger, resentment, shame, blame, guilt. He now has more hardware. That's resilience. You see, you can have consciousness. Meditation is consciousness. Mindfulness is consciousness. Tapping is consciousness. But these things are producing direct, measurable, and rapid changes in your brain. In one of my MRI studies, it was a randomized controlled trial. I do a lot of work with Australia. So this was at Bond University. And we found that in just 4 weeks of doing meditation, that it triggered measurable changes in the brain. And so the subtitle of this brain is the neuroscience of remodeling your brain for resilience, creativity, and joy. So you've changed your consciousness. You're firing groups of neurons. Those neurons are wiring and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, in just 8 weeks, a 23% increase in those neural bundles. That's resilience. That means that when you have that divorce, when you have that death, when you have that financial crash, when you lose that job, when your kid goes off the rails, when your parent gets Alzheimer's, you don't just have thinking, you have brain tissue. It's like, I can bench press about 200 pounds. My biceps are about 13 inches around. Jason Momoa can bench press 400 pounds. His biceps are 18 inches around. He just has the neurological, he just has the muscle fibers in his biceps to do that. I can have the intention of bench pressing 400 pounds. I can psych myself up to bench press 400 pounds. I don't have enough muscle mass. In the same way, most people trying to be resilient don't have enough neurological mass in that emotional regulation circuit. But the good news is you can train yourself. It can grow with the right techniques by about 10% a month. So now you aren't resilient as an idea, you are resilient at the level of brain structure. And that makes you able to cope with all of those upsets of life.
So we talk a lot about the term toxic positivity, where we just try and ignore our negative emotions and we just try and like paint a happy face on it. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that's such a thing, or do you think that you can think your way out of negative thought patterns and depression and things like that?
If you just put a happy face on it, then it becomes the dark side, becomes the shadow side, becomes unprocessed, unhealed trauma. There's a really interesting concept. You'll never have heard this word before, but it's spelled Hwabung, Hwabung. And you know how, if you've met Japanese people, they're very nice. They smile and they bow. And you meet Korean people, you meet Chinese people, they smile, they bow. You watch them talk, they're very civil, they're very nice to each other. Hwabung is a Korean word in the Korean language. And there are a lot of studies of it. And it's called repressed anger. Those people who are smiling and bowing, often they are absolutely livid with anger inside. And that repressed anger, in South Korean studies of EFT and other stress reduction techniques, is linked to heart disease, to cancer, to all kinds of ill effects. So painting the smiling face on the tragedy is not going to do it. You have to have a really effective stress reduction technique like EFT. You have to go down into the dark side. In fact, EFT's basic statement is, you tap and say, even though this terrible thing happened, and you face the terrible thing, and then you also say, and I'm safe now, and I accept my life the way it is. So we don't promise you improvement in EFT. You just tap and you say, this happened, and it really is terrible. It's a tragedy, and I'm alive, and I've got through it, and I'm safe at this very moment. When you do that, when you accept the bad things in your life and you tap and release the energy, then you move through them. Now, if you talk about them, those negative things, and you do not tap, and you aren't getting therapy, and you aren't having a catharsis, then there's this phenomenon called re-traumatization. You telling your sad story over and over and over again lights up those neural bundles. You make them bigger and faster, and then you descend into tragedy. PTSD, untreated, gets worse over time. In a study of 5,300 first responders to the World Trade Center disaster, I talk about this in my book, Mind to Matter, about the study. Half of those diagnosed with PTSD were fine after the World Trade Center disaster. When they were diagnosed 6 months or a year later, they tested fine. 2 years later, 5 years later, they're showing up with flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, all those PTSD symptoms. They didn't get treatment initially because treatment wasn't necessary. They had no symptoms initially. After 2, 3, 5 years, their PTSD was getting worse because their neural bundles were firing and wiring along those pathways. So you want to let that stuff go and have catharsis. Repeating your same old story over and over and over again, the negative, tragic story will light up those neural bundles and your symptoms may well get worse. If you just paint a happy face over tragedy, then you repress it, it becomes the dark side. It's toxic for your body. You have to face the music. There is no transcendence of all that bad stuff. You have to go there into the dark side, tap, release it. But the good news is That's what resilience is and how you get there. You release it, then you can start to move naturally into the positivity. Like we train our practitioners in our live workshops. We say, let your clients go wallow in all the darkest parts of their lives, because guess what? This is probably the first time they've had a safe space to do that without somebody saying, somebody trying to cheer them up. Let them go to the dark places, but make sure they're tapping and releasing at the same time. So you go to the dark places, you tap, you release. Then naturally, we train our practitioners to look for the client coming into the light. They'll then say, I now realize I survived that. I'm a survivor. I'm a strong person. I have resources. And your client then starts telling you how they are able to overcome. So that's the way you handle both going into the dark side and then moving into the light side.
I want to know some practical information about EFT. We have an app that we use when we have done EFT, my daughter and I. And do you want to tell us a little bit about how you actually do it? I mean, you keep saying that we're tapping. Are we tapping on certain points? Are we tapping for certain amounts of time? Is this something that we can do on our own? Is it something that we need to do with a practitioner or with a guide? And how do we learn how to do it? All of those things. That was like 37 questions in one go.
Yeah, no, those are well worth considering, because you can usually tap on things for self-help yourself. And so I have a free manual online. It's called EFT Mini Manual. You can just download the mini manual and you'll be tapping away in a few moments. Go and use the app. The apping is done by a friend of mine called Nick Ortner. Use the app, download the app, use the app, use the manual, use the app, use it as self-help. But if you're dealing with psychological trauma, go to the website, my website, EFT Universe. Get the services of a trained trauma specialist. Don't try dealing with trauma yourself. It can become overwhelming very, very easily. And so I worked with one woman, for example. She sat down to work with me in a workshop. We began tapping, and she just dissolved into tears. She couldn't talk, she couldn't tap. She was overwhelmed by trauma. That's emotional flooding, and that's the risk of trying to do it yourself. So if you've got a situation like you have test anxiety, you have presentation anxiety, fear of flying, all those things are easy to use as self-help. If you're dealing with things like a persistent problem, one example is self-sabotage. If you're dealing with self-sabotage, probably you'll need a practitioner to help you get to the bottom of it. If you're dealing with overeating or binge eating, if you're dealing with relationship sabotage, if you're dealing with anything traumatic, if you were abused as a child, don't just go into the wilderness of trauma yourself and try and figure it out. Get a guide, get somebody who knows the territory, get a practitioner for that. So some things use it as self-help. Other things, if they're difficult or complex or traumatic, get appropriate professional help.
So the app that you mentioned that was Nick Ortner's Tapping Solutions.
Tapping Solution app, yes. And then my book is called the EFT Mini Manual. It's free. It's free download. Just download that. And you'll be tapping in a few moments, and you'll feel the difference in your body.
And when you're tapping, is tapping sufficient on its own, or do you need to be also thinking through certain thoughts? Do you need to be reprocessing memories or reprocessing whatever you're going through, or is it just the tapping alone that helps with those?
Not only do you think the thoughts and think the most negative thoughts you can, we actually encourage people to just dive into their negativity, dive into their tragedy. In fact, if they have a little number, if they have a small amount of triggering, see if you can increase it and really light up those neural bundles. And that's a process called counter conditioning. So you have a conditioned response already, that your brain works in a certain way, your mind works in a certain way, you're conditioned in a certain way. EFT is counter conditioning. And so the more strongly you can evoke the conditioned response to the brain first before you tap, more effectively you can counter condition it. So you want to really focus on the bad stuff. And so we encourage people to delve into the dark side, tragedy, grief, trauma, tears. This woman who dissolved into tears was flooded with emotion. She couldn't even speak. In fact, she couldn't even tap. She just sat there staring at me, just tears streaming down her face. Now, it turned out her father had died recently and her son was in jail. And she just had a lot of tragedies in her life, totally emotionally flooded. That's the time when you need a practitioner. But with just tapping along, for a while. She eventually came through it. She was able to tap again, able to talk again, and then move through a lot of childhood stuff very, very quickly. So you want to make sure you are keeping the clearing process going. And again, a lot of it you can do yourself. Some you may need professional help with, but keeping the process of catharsis going and don't get stuck in it. Feel the bad feelings, intensify them if necessary. Really give yourself a chance to explore the dark side, because you now have an effective stress reduction technique in tapping.
So we are in post-ish, mid-pandemic, COVID, whatever. Everything is a mess. And therapy and other things sometimes have been moved online. Some people are still able to go in person. Will you tell us, is it effective via app versus in person with a practitioner?
We found it was surprisingly effective done on an app, just being guided through using an app script. And we thought it was also very effective being done with a practitioner via a teleclass, like a Zoom type interface. So both of those worked well. We haven't compared it directly to in-person tapping yet. We're in the process of doing that now. We'll have some research published on that probably in the next year. But the initial indications are that they're effective in bringing down people's levels of triggering.
I have a weird question.
Only one?
I'm not making any promises. Can somebody else tap on you and it will work? Or is it the action of you tapping yourself? So if somebody else taps those points, does it do anything? Do you know?
Well, theoretically, like when you get acupuncture, the acupuncturist is putting needles in and they're the one doing the needling. And so someone tapping on you should be able to stimulate the points as well. We discourage practitioners from doing that. We want to empower clients. For example, I was in doing some group therapy in Fort Hood. We had a group of veterans with PTSD in a circle, and they were all in this treatment program, and they were all getting EFT and EMDR and other therapies to help them get through it. And one of the young men there was so angry. He said, when I drove up to the gate this morning, and Fort Hood is the biggest military base in the US. It's the size of a city, it's so big. And I think there are 4 entrances to it, 4 driveways to go to. But there are often long lines of cars there. And this young man was saying, I was getting so angry with the idiot guard at the gate because he was so inefficient. He wasn't letting people through effectively. I could have pulled out my sidearm and shot him. I was like, whoa, okay, let's hold some tapping around that. But this kid, he had tapping. He just tapped himself. So he was tapping on himself and was able to let it go. And so we want to empower people to tap on themselves. So yes, you can tap on other people, but even for kids, I'd much rather show them how to tap on themselves than to tap on them. Put the power back in their hands.
I have a question because I have used EFT and it's been really helpful for me. And I've now, instead of just doing the app at home, at night when I need it, whatever, if I'm in a situation, say I'm out in public or I'm working and there are people around, I don't even know if this is a responsible use of EFT, but sometimes the only thing I'm able to do is to do it on my hand because I don't want to go through the whole thing. And someone's like, why are you tapping next to your eye? What is wrong with you? Like, are you playing like head, shoulders, knees, and toes or something? Is that something that if you are in the quote emergency situation, like, can you do something that's more able to be hidden like that? Or do you have to go through all of the points?
There are also optional points on your fingers. So like if I was, for example, in a tense business meeting in person, and my hands were there below the table, you can tap like this. I'm tapping on points just by doing this over here with my hands, which you can do under the table. You can tap on a certain point. I often will be if I'm talking to somebody I'm a little bit unsure, for example, I'll just do this. I'll just rub, this is the stomach meridian. This is the kidney meridian over here. So I'll just rub that meridian like this. Looks like pretty natural. Well, I'll think, what's the answer to that question? So you can actually touch most of the points pretty spontaneously. People are touching them all the time to release their stress. So you can find some little way of at least stimulating some of the meridians unobtrusively with your fingertips like this below the level of a table, or just touching or tapping or rubbing a few of the points. Rubbing also works pretty well.
Can we just stop and consider the term tapping responsibly? Is this a responsible use of tapping?
Do you need a license or a designated driver?
We need shirts that say that. Tapping responsibly.
I know, right? What other are you participating or like leading some studies currently other than what you've talked about that are kind of fascinating or up and coming?
I've spent about 15 years now researching and working with trauma, psychological trauma and PTSD, because I so want the person who was abused as a child to have a path out of PTSD. I want the war veteran. I want the person who's had an accident or a terrible marriage or a terrible divorce or a terrible death or a terrible loss. I want those people to have the tools to release them from trauma. But what we're finding, and what I found in my own life, is when you're enmeshed in trauma, you're reactive, you're emotionally reactive, and you re-traumatize yourself. And when you finally get free of all that, what happens next? And what happens next is really interesting. What happens next is people start to move to peak states. And so, for example, we have a certification program. We train coaches, and we train them after they've learned to release trauma, to then move on to helping their clients not just feel okay, but how about peak states, peak emotional states, peak mental states? When you read Rumi, you read some Catherine of Siena, read the great mystics. I mean, they are passionately in love with life. They're having these experiences of oneness with the universe. And what I call in my book, Mind to Matter, I call it non-local mind. They're merging with the all that is. Buddhists talk about merging with the all that is. Taoists merging with the Tao. Christian mystics talk about these elevated states. So when you release trauma, what happens? And what happens is that your human potential starts to pour through you, and you start to move into elevated states of consciousness. So in my more recent research, I'm working with neuroscientists. We're mapping what those states are. We're looking at the ancient spiritual traditions, what those teach us about those states, but then seeing them through the lens of neuroscience and brain science. So now we're taking these ancient experiences, ancient milestones in the mystical journey, and we're looking at them through the lens of the brain. And so in Bliss Brain, I talk about the enlightenment network of the brain and how to actually light up these 4 systems within the enlightenment network. And you do this often enough, and you start to have amazing peak experiences. And so my new research is all about those, about flow states, about peak states, about mystical states, and happiness. You just get so unbelievably happy. You just wake up every morning and you're just in bliss. When you read some Catherine or Rumi, these people weren't just feeling okay. If you said Rumi or St. Catherine, how are you today? They wouldn't say, I'm getting by, I'm okay. They would say, I'm passionately in love with the universe. I mean, St. Francis of Assisi talked about being ravished by God. They're having these passionate experiences of mystical oneness with the all that is. And so I'm so intrigued by these experiences, and then plotting them neurologically, and then having people go into a lab, us analyzing how they get there, and then having people start to get there really quickly. I did one study recently, and we looked at people in an MRI, and we found that in just 4 weeks of doing meditation, these very special meditations that are based on neuroscience, that was triggering enormous shifts. The suffering part of the brain is called the default mode network, and the mid-prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain, literally in 4 weeks just went dark. And the compassion part of the brain after 4 weeks was lit up like a Christmas tree. These people are having radically different brain changes as a result of consciousness. So my newest research is all about these elevated states of consciousness and how to get there without 10,000 hours, without declaring vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, going into a monastery for 10 years. I'm not that kind of a researcher. So I want to get there reliably and quickly and help people experience these ecstatic states that lie beyond trauma.
Before we ask this most important question, will you tell us again
the names of your books, and we will link to your books and your site and the downloads and everything in the show notes. And I want to read all of them. What are they?
Okay, so epigenetics, how consciousness affects the expression of your genes. Your thinking, your consciousness is literally turning genes on and off in your cells. Not just a few genes. We have research showing EFT is turning on genes that suppress cancer cells, that build neural sheaths in your brain that make your neurons work better and faster. It's turning up longevity genes. It's turning up cell metabolism genes. So that's my first book. It's called The Genie in Your Genes, all about epigenetics and the science of epigenetics and how we can just change our gene expression with our consciousness. So that's Genie in Your Genes. Then I wrote a book called Mind to Matter, because my wife is a real believer in the whole idea that your thoughts create your reality. And as a scientist, I was skeptical. So I began to look at the research, and I found one study, and then 2 studies, and then 400 studies. So that's the book, Mind to Matter. And it all shows how we literally create material reality, the stuff around us. We literally are making it up using our brains and our minds. So Mind to Matter was my next major book, and then just came out Bliss Brain, and that's about these elevated states. Because I had my own like dark experience in 2017, actually about 4 years ago, when my wife woke me up in the middle of the night and said something's wrong. I looked out of the window, there was a glow on the horizon. I walked outside, there was a wildfire sweeping toward our home, and we had just moments to grab the car keys and throw on some clothes and sprint out to our car and drive out through the flames. And it was the biggest fire at that point to engulf Northern California, destroyed 5,000 homes. We barely escaped. Many of our neighbors died. It was just terrible. And so there I was, suddenly, I was busy writing a book on resilience, and after Mind to Matter. And suddenly we literally lost everything. We lost every single possession we had, except for our car keys, our phone, and the car we drove out with. So I tell that story in Bliss Brain, and there I was, just having lost everything, and it got worse from that point on. So there were a lot of bad things that happened to us, but again, it's the story of resilience, how we learned to bounce back after that series of tragedies. So that book is there, and just shows you how to grow a resilient brain, and also then move to these states. Because the year after the fire, I was just sitting down in the mornings to meditate, and I would just cry with bliss, with ecstasy. I was in such a state of absolute joy, and I thought, this is nuts. How can a guy who's just lost his home, we also lost our retirement savings, and I'd have an operation. There was a lot of other bad things that happened as well. And I'd sit there in the morning and I would just be in bliss. How does that happen? So I wrote a book about that. So Bliss Brain is the most recent one. And it's also really a good guide, a primer on how to do those things, how to reach those states yourself.
The universe is kind of a jerk, because you're like, I'm learning about resilience, and it was like, bam, here you go.
Yeah, right.
But he has that thing in his brain that can lift like 80 million pounds.
The dentate gyrus. Mm-hmm.
Dentate gyrus. Very good. If you can say that, you get a PhD. So Nita, that's dentate gyrus. Ready?
Yeah, I have my PhD in dentate gyrus. Thank you so much. Your many educational studies have not prepared you for this question. What is your favorite cheese?
Oh, that would be hard, because there's so many wonderful cheeses. I have aged Gouda is basically cream that's been solidified. It's like a cross between cream and caramel. And it was created by a person to make you mindful. It was just created to trigger mind. You cannot eat aged Gouda without becoming mindful. So I even after eating aged Gouda for close to 70 years now, I put that aged Gouda in my mouth. And I let it dissolve slowly. I drool down my chin.
So aged Gouda helps you with resiliency. That's what you're saying?
I think that means we need to go buy some. He's a doctor.
Okay, all the widows, when we have our next hang, aged Gouda. Let's see if it works. We would love to participate in your clinical study of aged Gouda and trauma. We're here for you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an absolute pleasure. You are a smarty pants, fancy pants, and cool pants all in one. So thank you. And we hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode and have heard some things that might spark some curiosity and interest in maybe trying something new and seeing if some of these things will work for you and changing how you're thinking and your stress levels and your traumatic experiences and remembering and reprocessing those. So thank you. Remember to check out the Widow Wives Club on Facebook. If you're not already in our Widow Wives Club, it's for anybody who's lost a romantic partner, whether you're married, unmarried,
Any orientation, all y'all.
And if you want to keep the podcast going, make sure you check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/WWDN.
If you want to buy us some tacos, go to buymeacoffee.com/widowwedonoww.
And we might get some aged Gouda too with the taco money. I don't know. We'll see. Until we talk to you next, I'm Anita.
I'm Mel.
I'm Dawson.
We're just two young widows and one magician who uses words like dentate gyrus. And we're all just trying to figure out,
Widow, we do now. This is my favorite thing to discuss with you.
Tell me, what is it?
One of my favorite things. I do enjoy tacos and cheese and dogs. This is about how you cannot pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a phone plan, especially when you're a widow, your person is dead, you might have kids, you might need another option, and you just want your phone to work, you want unlimited texting and service, and you want it to be like $25 a month.
It blows my mind that they have plans that start at $15 a month. That is so cheap. And the cool thing is it uses other 5G networks, and so you don't have to pay extra for that, and you still get great service.
Yep, Anita and I have traveled all over, and I have used my phone. So I highly recommend it, and my mom's even on it. When my dad died, we put his phone down to the cheapest plan, which is $15 a month. And I think my mom's on the $20 a month plan, and it's so worth it. It's so much cheaper than what we were all paying before. So I highly recommend it if you're on a budget or not. Who cares? Ryan Reynolds is in charge of the company, and they send you free stickers with Ryan Reynolds temporary tattoos. It's kind of the best. So if somebody wants to sign up, what can they do, Anita?
Go to trymintmobile.com/WWDN. Seriously, you guys, such a great idea. Save yourself some money.
And if you're worried about losing data or having any changes with your phone, not going to happen. They walk you through it. Everything's fine. It's the easiest process of all time. Again, that's
trymintmobile.com/WWDN.